I recently posted a series of pictures on Twitter showing the shelves at Barnes& and Noble and the fact that manga was far outpacing Western graphic novels by almost 3 to 1. The shelf space is just taking over. It got a lot of attention, and last I saw, it was well over 10,000 likes and it was getting retweeted all over the place. I was surprised that people were picking up on it. But like they say, a picture tells 1,000 words, and this kind of put a point. But why is it? Why is manga seemingly outselling it, or is it? Is this even true? Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, this is Perch. This is one of those topics that it's important to note at the beginning that what you like, what you personally are entertained by, whether it's manga, Western graphic novels, indie work, the big two, that's up to you. It's your business. It's what you enjoy. And regardless of what the numbers say or what's selling, it doesn't really matter. It's you who's spending the money. So it's really you who matters. A lot of people get hung up in these arguments because they find that the thing that they like is not as popular. And so they get angry and they get frustrated about it and they want to argue the numbers. The numbers are just the numbers. But the numbers don't take away from your own enjoyment and never should. But I posted these two pictures and basically showing that over the course, and I've noticed at my local Barnes & Noble here, and by the way, a bunch of people are like, there's still a Barnes & Noble? Yes, it's still in business. It's still doing as fine as, anything else in retail these days. But yeah, it's still in business and in this area doing a healthy business. But graphic novels, comic books, indies, and everything else used to take up roughly 10 shelves, front and back, at the Barnes & Noble where I live. Today, that's down to 5. So it's cut in half. Meanwhile, manga has expanded to almost a complete U-shape where there is almost 20 shelves of manga going on. Why is this? What's changed? Well, there's two reasons behind this. One very obvious, one not as obvious. And then there's a lot of other details around this. And I'm going to try and go into some of these factors here on the channel, probably in some other videos, because I think it's an interesting case study. And there's a lot of ins and outs to it. First off, I want to give you these two reasons. Let me start with the less obvious one. And I say less obvious, actually super obvious once you know the details, but those details aren't usually shared. And it's simply this. The margin for the bookseller is far higher for manga. We know by the numbers what is offered, manufacturer's retail MSRP, the suggested retail price or the book price, versus the wholesale price, what the bookstore is having to pay for it. There's about 30 to 40% greater margin on manga. Now, why is this? Well, some of it's the paper, some of it's how it's printed, some of it's just it's done as kind of a transfer of existing content over to the U.S. So it's a different business model. The return on investment, the recoupability is just it's different. And so as a result, if a bookstore is wanting to make more of a profit, manga is far more appealing because for every unit sold, they're making quite a bit more than a Western graphic novel. Now, the argument being the Western graphic novel companies, in particular kind of Marvel, DC, some of the others, would argue that they're supported by movies and other things. I mean, you got The Watchmen, that's very well known, Batman, very well known, way more well known than, say, Berserk or One Piece or One Punch Man or some of these others in the U.S. So therefore, they should demand higher money. And that's true, except we've hit a tipping point where the bookstores are just going for this other content because it's just, if they can turn it into a consumable read, it's just more cost effective for them. It's as simple as that. I think the more obvious reason is a little bit more tricky. And here's where a lot of people have a lot of opinions. And who's to say? We don't have a complete, poll or a survey to tell us exactly why this is. But I think there's one kind of core reason why manga has an easier time selling in a bookstore like Barnes & Noble. And I think these rules are different if you're in a local comic shop or other places. But, if you're putting in manga versus kind of the big two, the comic publisher graphic novels. And by the way, for the purpose of this argument, and I'll get to it in a minute, Things like Babysitter's Club and Dogman and the Rain to Tellmeyer books and all of that is a third category of graphic novels. I know a lot of them are called graphic novels, but right now I'm talking about Marvel, DC, Image, kind of the indie comic market in that realm. We'll get to the others in a moment. But there's one, and if you go and you just look at the shelves and you just take your own preconceived notions out of your mind and you just try and be honest about it, the manga has one huge advantage, particularly for new readers. It's very easy to know where to begin. If you look at a book, you can see pretty simply, even from the spines, things that are action, things that are sci-fi, things that are romance, things that are slice of life, etc. Manga, in some cases, will even advertise this is a slice of life on the spine or action story right there. It's very, very easy for you to figure out what it is that you're buying. And with American Western graphic novels, it's very hard. It's if you know Watchmen, great, you know kind of what you're in for. If you know Spider-Man, you still don't know kind of what Spider-Man story you're getting. Are you getting a, in theory, a Cape Spider-Man book? Are you getting more of a dramatic? It's harder to tell. If you're a parent buying a book for a kid, manga is just marketed and packaged way easier to be consumed, even though the character of Spider-Man is more recognizable. And there's one other huge factor too. If you're coming in new to a series, most manga books are there by chapters. It's like, here's book 1, here's book 2, here's book 3. In the case of One Piece, here's book 97. It's very, very easy to tell where to start. With Western graphic novels, it's incredibly hard. Again, go to the shelves yourself, stare at it, and pretend that you don't know anything about comics or coming in new, and try and figure out where to begin with titles like Avengers or Black Panther. You have no idea. And in fact, if you pick these things up, you'll frequently there's very, very few graphic novels on the shelves that are the beginning of these characters. It is why I do believe things like Squirrel Girl and Miss Marvel and some of those books sold initially well as trade paperbacks, because it was volume 1. Start here. Here's Miss Marvel. Here's a new character. Begin here. Imagine if Marvel or DC had done that for more of their books. Now, I've talked to some of the publishers and some of the editors about why they don't do this, and the answer is usually, well, if we did that, we'd have to start back in the 60s, and no kid in 2010 is going to want to read books in the 60s. Besides, some of them are problematic. Okay, well, let's take that argument and look at it two ways. First off, I'm not convinced that the art and the sensibility of the 60s are so terrible for kids. Granted, it doesn't look contemporary, but in a lot of cases, if you're trying to get a new audience, Jack Kirby art, Steve Ditko art, some of this stuff, it does just fine. I mean, it seems to be doing okay for manga. There is manga that is pretty rough in terms of drawing, or certainly seems, stylistically very simple. It's not unlike a lot of the early Batman, Superman comics. It would work as a starting place. The second comment of it's problematic, I mean, here's where people are just overthinking it. Is it true that a lot of comic characters back in the 40s when they were fighting into the war would say, arguably things that are racist today? Yeah, but one, you could probably edit that pretty easy. It's not as terrible as you think. And two, I think that people are overthinking what's problematic and what needs to be cleaned up. In most cases, you don't need to clean up a lot of these things. A lot of current sensibility and current angst and current worries are making their way into current comics, and it's not necessary to go down that full path. But that could be a whole other video in itself. Now, there's been a comment of, well, this is what happens because Western comics are trash, either because they are, they've done the go woke, go broke model, or the artists and the writers are just of a lower quality. Well, those are kind of two different things, but I think there's more merit in the second, and let me explain why. First off, if you're familiar with manga and you've read a bunch of manga, you will notice that there's plenty of politics and other pieces in manga. It's Donald Trump has appeared in lots of manga in pretty unflattering ways. Manga doesn't shy away from politics. In fact, it covers it in many ways all the time. But I would argue that manga typically covers politics in ways more similar to how comics covered politics in the 80s and 90s. In other words, they do it in a more evergreen way. If you pick up a book that is, reasonably political, you could read it 10 years from now and it's not going to seem out of date or weird. Maybe they've got Abe or some of the current faces in the books, but it still is written in such a way that it can exist 10 years from now and not seem weird. Granted, they have done, the Western politicians typically look like the Western politician of the day, usually white, old, dude, and fat. But again, the politics are handled in such a way that feels like it has more lifespan than what U.S. comics have kind of moved to more recently, where they're making topical current jokes about the internet or about politics or about these other elements. They don't hold up more over time. Now I'm speaking in generalizations, and you can find examples of, to contradict me on both sides, but the handling is just slightly different. But to people who say, well, there's no woke, quote unquote, politics at all in manga, that's not true. There's plenty of LGBTQ issues. There's plenty of other things going on. It's just the handling of them is different. And again, maybe that's a whole video in itself of how they're different, but they are different. Now, the second complaint I think actually has quite a bit more merit, and that's that the writing and the artist quality is poorer in Western comics. Well, I think there's two factors that go on that are worth thinking about. The first is that most manga contains a similar art style. Not exactly the same, but there's definitely a style that is consistent across manga. But more importantly, and by the way, people can point out, no, like, Fist of the North Star versus Ranma 1/2 versus One Piece, very, very different art styles. Yes, it's true, but there is a level of consistency in the quality and the style of these books that is very different if you do kind of three random, pieces in Western comics. And therein lies, I think, the biggest problem in terms of the art and the writing, is that in manga, typically you get a writer, artist, creator who sticks with the series from beginning to end. Yes, there are examples of different people coming in, but generally it's one person's vision. It's one person's vision from the start of the story to the conclusion of the story. If you pick up books 1, 10, and 30 of One Piece, you'll notice it all kind of looks the same. The characters definitely evolve, the situation changes, but you don't have wildly changing things. You don't go from like Todd McFarlane to Mark Bagley to, current Spider-Man writers and artists. You don't have, Stan Lee one day and then Peter David another day and then, Nick Spencer another day. You don't have these kinds of wild changes. And in terms of new readers, people coming in who are wanting something casual, and that's the audience Barnes & Noble is probably serving, it's a whole lot easier to dive into manga. Significant. You can pick up any book. It looks consistent. It looks like you're getting an ongoing story. And so a lot of that stuff really holds up over time. Now, I may be wrong about this, but that to me feels like a little bit of what's going on. And that's why I do think the market is different at a local comic shop and other places. Barnes & Noble is serving as a big box retailer, is serving people coming in many cases, new and casual readers, and I would argue probably the readers that most of the big publishers really want to get. But manga is a much more appealing package to them. Most of the problems I've been discussed by that I've been talking about could be solved by just some better packaging and marketing on the part of Western comics. You can solve many of those issues. Maybe not the writer-artist one over time, but most of the rest you could solve. They're just not. Now, I mentioned earlier, I'd say it here, the other big elephant in the room is things like I said, Babysitter Club, Dogman, the Raina Telgemeier books. There is a huge growing shelf space in the bookstore, in Barnes & Noble, for those graphic novels. But if you look at them, they're almost identical in how they're packaged and marketed as manga. The writer-artist typically is the same. The volumes are clearly labeled on the spine. What you're in for, kind of comedy, romance, slice of life, etc., is also clearly labeled there. Just on the bookshelf, they're much easier to sort and produce and get. If you look at the two together, they're very similar. The Western graphic novels from that group is almost identical to manga, whereas the Western comic publishers from Marvel, DC are dramatically different. It's blowing like crazy here. I don't know if any of this is picked up in the background. Anyway, I'm outside recording. What can I say? Those are some thoughts on my end. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on all this. If you think any of this stuff has merit, I would love to get your opinion on it. But these are just, I think, some of the factors that go into, this issue. And again, a lot of people go to the, Western comics went woke. I mean, I think it's more complicated than that. I think there's elements of truth in terms of how the storytelling was done and what's promoted and where. But I think these other factors are probably bigger. And in many ways, that's bad news because I think they're more crippling unless they get their act together. You can always change the writer. You can pivot on the subject matter content in your comic. It's a lot harder to fix some of these fundamental problems. In my opinion, anyway. Let me know your thoughts below. Hey, like if you were happy with what you heard. Dislike if you're not, or you just are a jerk. One of those. Subscribe. Follow me on social media. Send me an email. But most importantly, thanks for listening.